He was just a farmer in the 19th century, desperately trying to save his land. When he drilled into the ground, he found not water, but a strange black sludge. He was ridiculed, gave up, and sold his land for pennies, without even knowing that beneath it lay oil that would one day change the world. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The land had once been alive. That was the thought that rose with Elias Harper every morning when he stepped off the warped porch boards of his homestead and set his boots upon the soil. He had to remind himself of it, because without memory, there was only the dry present. Beneath the broad sky of the Western Territories, the ground stretched in pale sheets of dust, cracked and splintered like pottery, left too long in the fire. When the wind blew across the prairie, it lifted the dust in low, bitter clouds that clung to his clothes and burned in his eyes. In years gone by, the same wind had carried scents of alfalfa, of wildflowers and hay, and had rippled through tall grasses where his cattle grazed until their hides shone like polished leather. Now it carried only the sharp dryness of desolation, and with every breath, Elias felt the weight of a curse. His ranch had stood longer than most in that valley. He had built the barn himself with his father, the two of them raising the beams on a spring day, while his mother and sisters brought water in tin pails. The house had grown in stages. One room when he first married, another when the children were born, and a porch when his wife Martha had said she longed for a place to sit in the evening and watch the light fade. Once there had been laughter in every wallboard and the smell of beans simmering on the stove. Now silence lingered like a guest overstaying its welcome, broken only by the creak of an unsteady shutter or the call of a lonely crow perched on a fence post. The drought had not arrived suddenly. It had crept in little by little, a season of shorter rains, a summer of hotter winds, then another. The creek that once ran behind the cottonwoods had grown shallow until it was only a bed of stones, and then even the stones lay buried under dust. At first, Elias had told himself it was another lean year, one of many, nothing that could not be endured with patience. But seasons lengthened into years, and patience turned into resignation. His neighbors, men he had known since youth, began to sell their land to traveling agents or abandon it altogether, loading their wagons with what possessions they could carry and driving east toward towns where water still flowed. Elias stayed. He was not blind to the ruin around him. He watched cattle with ribs like washboards fall in the pasture, and he saw the corn shrivel before it ever reached his knees. But his father had died on this land, and his grandfather before him had carved it from wilderness with axe and plow. "Hold it," his grandfather used to say, leaning on a cane as his beard lifted in the wind. "They'll try to take it, but don't let them. The land is who we are." Those words had been burned into Elias's memory deeper than any scripture, and to let go now would be to betray not only the dead, but every bone of his own body. In town, they called him a fool. At the saloon, men muttered that old Harper was waiting to be buried by the desert itself. The sheriff, a weary man who had lost half his herd and planned to leave by winter, stopped at the ranch one afternoon to talk sense into him. "Elias," he had said, squinting under the brim of his hat, "there's nothing left here but bones and dust. Don't waste what years you have left." Elias had answered only with a steady gaze, his jaw set as if carved from the same stubborn rock as the hills. The sheriff had ridden away, shaking his head, muttering something about pride killing more men than bullets. Every night Elias sat by the hearth, where only ashes remained now, and spoke to Martha as though she still sat across from him. Her grave lay beneath a cottonwood tree on the rise behind the house. The tree itself was nearly bare, its branches brittle, but he still walked there often, hat in hand, speaking softly to the mound of earth. "I'm holding on," he would whisper. "As long as I breathe, I'll hold." Sometimes he imagined her answer, gentle but firm, reminding him that promises made at the altar and in the soil were not meant to be broken. Inside the barn hung the tools of a life that seemed to have slipped through his fingers. Axes dulled with rust, a plow missing a blade, bridles stiff as boards. In the corner stood the skeleton of his old wagon, the spokes cracked and the iron bands loose. Dust coated everything. He would run his fingers over the beams and feel the grooves his father had carved, initials cut deep into the wood when he was a boy. Each mark was a reminder that he was not merely a man upon a plot of land, but the last bearer of a chain stretching back through generations. Still, even the strongest chain can grow thin. Elias felt it each morning when his knees stiffened and his back ached. His sons wrote from Denver and San Francisco, urging him to sell and join them. "The land's dead," one letter had said bluntly. "You're killing yourself for nothing." He had folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer, unable to burn it, yet unwilling to read it again. He knew they did not understand. To them, the farm was a prison, a place of hardship and lost opportunities. To him, it was blood and memory. The nights were the hardest. Alone on the porch, he listened to the coyotes howl and the wind whistle through the eaves, and he felt the silence pressing against him like a weight. Sometimes he drank from a bottle to soften the edges, but more often he sat sober, staring at the stars that glittered with cold light above the parched earth. In the stillness, he asked himself whether he had the strength for one more season. Each time he thought of his grandfather's cane thumping against the ground, and he clenched his fists with renewed resolve. One evening, after a day spent wandering the barren fields, Elias sat on the porch with Martha's photograph balanced on his knee. Her eyes, though faded by time, seemed to study him with both tenderness and reproach. He heard his father's voice in memory, rough with conviction. "You can lose your money, your stock, even your home, but never the land. The land is who we are." Elias whispered the words aloud, his throat tightening. "I won't let it die." That night he did not sleep. He paced the wooden floors, the house echoing with each creak. At dawn he stood by the window, watching the first pale light wash over the cracked fields. His gaze shifted to the corner of the yard, where an old collection of scrap iron and timber lay. An idea began to form, bold and reckless, but it gripped him with the force of desperation. If the skies would not give him water, then he would wrest it from the earth itself. He would dig, he would bore, he would fight the ground until it yielded. The next day he set to work. He rummaged through the barn, dragging out iron wheels, rusted gears, and wooden beams, piecing together a crude rig with the ingenuity of a man who had spent his life making tools serve long after they should have been discarded. His hands bled as he hammered bolts and bound timber, his breath ragged in the heat. Neighbors passing on horseback slowed to watch, laughter curling from their lips as they shook their heads. "Harper's lost his wits," one called, "trying to punch a hole in hell for his supper." Elias ignored them. The sun burned his neck, sweat streaked his back, and his body throbbed with exhaustion, but his mind burned brighter than it had in years. By evening, a frame of iron and wood stood in the yard, awkward and towering, its silhouette stark against the setting sun. Elias leaned against it, panting, his chest tight with pain and pride. To anyone else, it looked like a pile of rust held together by stubbornness. To him, it was salvation. Tomorrow he would begin. Tomorrow he would set the bit into the soil and drill until he found the water that would save his land. He stood for a long time as the sky flamed red and the shadows lengthened across the fields. They looked like scars, dark and endless, but he imagined them green again, rippling with wheat and grass. He imagined the laughter of children running between rows of corn, the return of cattle grazing under the sun. The dream was fragile, yet it was his. As the stars appeared one by one, Elias Harper placed his calloused hand on the frame of the rig and swore aloud, "I'll fight for it until the end." And with that vow, the chapter of his life turned. The land around him was silent, cracked and thirsty, but in the heart of one old man, a stubborn flame still burned, and it was enough to begin again. When the first light of morning came spilling over the horizon, Elias Harper was already awake, standing in the yard with his eyes fixed on the crude drilling rig that rose like a gaunt skeleton against the pale sky. The vow he had made the night before had not faded with sleep. It lingered in him, pressing on his chest, urging his limbs to motion even though they trembled with age and fatigue. The earth stretched before him, vast and unyielding, its cracks yawning like wounds that refused to close, and Elias knew that if he could not find water beneath its surface, his fight would end here. But that thought did not frighten him any more. He was past fear. What remained was a stubborn will, older than the farm itself, older even than his name. He moved slowly at first, his knees stiff with the memory of long work and harder years. But as the sun climbed higher, his hands grew sure. He primed the old motor with oil that smelled sharp and metallic, pulled the lever until the gears caught, and listened to the machine come sputtering to life. It coughed and rattled as though protesting its own resurrection, yet the sound filled him with a strange exhilaration. The yard that had lain silent for years now shook with noise, and the rig trembled under his touch, like a horse eager for the reins. Elias guided the bit downward, lowering it inch by inch into the soil. Dust rose around him in choking clouds, clinging to his shirt and settling in his beard, but he pressed on. The first day was an agony of resistance. The bit struck stone again and again, sending shudders up through the frame and into his arms until his bones ached. He worked until sweat poured into his eyes, and his throat felt like parchment. His canteen emptied too quickly, and he cursed himself for not filling it twice. Still, he did not stop. He muttered encouragement to the rig as though it were an old mule, coaxing it with a patience born of desperation. By evening, when the sun sank red and swollen over the horizon, he shut down the motor and stood swaying in the dust. The earth had given him nothing. Not even a hint of dampness clung to the bit. Exhaustion dragged him down, and when he stumbled into the house, he collapsed onto the bed without undressing, his body burning with fatigue, his mind whispering that tomorrow must be different. The next morning he woke with his muscles stiff and his mouth dry, but the fire of determination still smoldered. He ate a crust of bread, swallowed the last of yesterday's coffee cold, and returned to the rig. The sun rose mercilessly, burning hotter than before, but Elias ignored the sting on his neck and shoulders. He set the motor growling again, and once more the bit into the soil. Rocks resisted him. Sparks flew where iron struck stone, and each jolt rattled his teeth. More than once he stumbled back, his vision swimming, but he would steady himself, spit into the dust, and force his body forward. He thought of his father, of nights when debts had pressed on the family like a noose, and of how the old man had endured by sheer will until morning. Light brought some reprieve. He told himself this was no different. The earth would break eventually. It had to. By noon of that second day, sweat poured from him in rivulets, soaking his shirt until it clung like a second skin. His lips cracked and bled, his hands blistered on the levers, and still he refused to pause longer than a swallow from the canteen. The rig rattled and shook so violently that he feared it might tear itself apart, but each time it stuttered, he coaxed it back into motion, whispering through clenched teeth as though bargaining with the very bones of the earth. When at last he shut it down at dusk, he could barely stand. He slumped against the iron frame, head bowed, and waited for some sign of dampness on the air, a whisper of coolness from below. There was nothing. Only silence and the settling of dust. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with Martha's photograph propped before him, he let the weight of despair press against his chest. "Am I chasing a ghost?" he asked the empty room, his voice raw. Tears welled in his eyes, but even as they fell, he shook his head. "No, I can't stop now. If I give up, everything we built dies with me." The third morning came heavy with heat, as though the very air had thickened into a blanket meant to smother him. Elias rose stiffly, every joint aching, but his heart carried a grim determination. He started the motor once more, the sound loud in the stillness, and lowered the bit again. The hours passed with the same grating rhythm of resistance. Dust rose, gears groaned, and his muscles screamed with every motion. Yet near midday, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the sound, a hollowness that crept into the rhythm of the drill. Elias froze, his hands tightening on the levers. He bent closer, straining to hear. Yes, it was there. The soil beneath was not solid. It echoed faintly, as though the bit had entered a chamber hidden deep underground. His pulse quickened. Hope surged through him, sharper than any pain. He pressed the drill downward, trembling with anticipation. For a long moment nothing happened, and then, with a groan that seemed to rise from the belly of the earth itself, the bit twisted, and something seeped upward from the hole. Elias stepped back, wiping dust and sweat from his eyes. At first he thought it might be water, darkened by soil. But when he dipped his fingers into it, he felt the thickness, the sticky weight that clung stubbornly to his skin. He held his hand up to the light and saw the black gleam. The smell hit him then, sharp and heavy, filling his nostrils until his stomach turned. It was not water. It was something else, something foul and strange, a tar-like substance that oozed with slow insistence. For a long while, Elias stood there, staring at the smear on his hand. Anger welled up in him, hot and fierce. He had given everything, his sweat, his strength, his hope for this, for filth that could not feed his cattle, could not quench his thirst, could not save the land. He slammed his fist into the dirt, cursing aloud until his voice cracked. The black liquid continued to seep, glistening in the sun as though mocking him. By evening, when the sun sank, and the hole stood quiet save for its strange offering, Elias dragged himself back to the house, his steps heavy with defeat. The smell clung to his clothes, a reminder of his failure, and when he tried to wash it from his skin, it lingered stubbornly. That night, he lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, his chest tight with despair. Yet beneath the bitterness, another thought stirred, small and insistent. The earth had answered, not with what he sought, but with something. He did not yet understand what it meant, but he could not shake the sense that the land had revealed a secret, whether curse or blessing. The next morning he walked back to the rig, drawn as though by invisible cords. The sun glared down, cruel as ever, but his eyes fixed on the dark stain around the hole. The liquid glistened where it had pooled, its surface slick, reflecting the light in strange, oily patterns. He folded his arms across his chest and squinted, confusion and dread twisting in his gut. He had begged the land for water, and it had given him this. He could cover the hole, bury the sight, and forget it. Yet curiosity gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. He had lived his whole life upon this soil, thought he knew every corner of it, and now here was proof that he did not. Something lay beneath his feet, something hidden through generations. He did not yet know its name. He did not yet know its power. To him, it was only a dark mystery, one more burden upon weary shoulders. Still, as he turned back toward the house, the image of that black gleam stayed with him, burning into his thoughts like a brand. And though despair still pressed heavy on his chest, Elias Harper knew he could not walk away from it. The land had spoken. It had not given him life, but it had given him a riddle, and whether he wished it or not, he was bound to seek its answer. The black substance clung to Elias Harper's memory as stubbornly as it had clung to his hands that day, when it first seeped from the earth. No matter how many times he washed, the smell lingered in his nose, heavy and sharp, like a ghost that refused to leave. Each morning when he walked past the rig, now silent and still, the hole yawned at him with its dark stain. He would pause, frown at it, and then turn away, though his thoughts circled back as persistently as vultures circling a carcass. He had asked the land for water, prayed for life, and the land had offered him a riddle, something that looked and smelled like death. The cattle did not drink it, the soil did not soften beneath it, and his thirst only grew. The days were hotter, the grass no greener, and the farm no closer to salvation. He could not shake the feeling that he had lost, not only his fight, but also the very respect of the earth itself. Neighbors began to talk louder now, no longer content to mutter behind his back at the feed store. They stopped at the fence when they passed on horseback, laughing openly, pointing toward the rig and the black muck around its base. "Old Harper found himself some swamp tar," one man jeered. "Maybe he'll start painting fences with it." Another added, "Or use it to grease his boots. That's all it's worth." Even the sheriff rode by one afternoon, squinting at the stain with an expression that was more pity than mockery. "You'll poison your land if you let that spread," he said. "Better cover it and let the earth be." Elias had only nodded stiffly, refusing to answer. Words would not change what he felt, and what he felt was an emptiness so vast that silence seemed the only reply. The weeks dragged on, and his farm grew weaker with each passing day. The cattle, once lean but proud, staggered through the fields, their bones jutting sharp beneath their hides. A calf collapsed by the dry creek bed, too weak to stand, and Elias knew then that even the herd was slipping away from him. He buried the calf himself, sweat stinging his eyes, his breath ragged, and when he was done, he stood for a long time, staring at the mound of earth. "I can't save even you," he muttered. The words cut deeper than any ridicule from his neighbors. Letters arrived from his sons, though less frequently now. One urged him to sell the farm and move to San Francisco where opportunities awaited. Another suggested he come to Denver to live with him until he was stronger. Both letters carried the same underlying message. Leave the land. Abandon what you cling to. It will only bury you. Elias folded the letters with trembling hands and placed them beside Martha's photograph. He could not bear to read them twice, but neither could he throw them away. They were pieces of his blood, even if they no longer understood the soil that had raised them. One evening, as the sun fell in a blaze of red behind the horizon, a carriage rolled down the road leading to his ranch. Its wheels cut through the dust with the confidence of wealth, and the man who stepped out when it halted was unlike the farmers Elias had known all his life. He was dressed in a dark coat despite the heat, his boots polished, his face smooth, and a chain glimmered from the pocket of his vest where a silver watch dangled. He introduced himself as Mr. Graham, a land broker who had been traveling through the territory, buying up properties before they lost their value entirely. His voice was smooth, his words careful, each one dipped in courtesy. Yet there was something in his eyes, a cold, assessing glint that unsettled Elias more than the ridicule of his neighbors. They walked the property together, Graham speaking gently about how hard life had become, how many families had already chosen the wiser path of selling and moving to town. He paused at the rig, wrinkling his nose at the black stain, and chuckled softly. "Strange stuff," he said. "Seen it before, near the mountains. Worthless. Clogs the wells and ruins the fields. Best to cut your losses before it spreads." Elias said nothing. His jaw tightened, but he let the man speak, because in truth, he had nothing left to argue. That night Elias sat at the kitchen table with Martha's picture before him, his hands clasped together, trembling with indecision. Graham had made him an offer, small, pitiful even, but more money than Elias had seen in a long while, enough to buy a modest room in town, perhaps enough to keep him from starving in his old age. He stared at the photograph, at the faint smile on his wife's lips, and whispered, "I held on, Martha. Longer than any man had a right to. But maybe I've lost." His voice broke, and he bowed his head, ashamed. For 2 more nights he walked the house like a restless ghost, standing at windows, staring out at the barren fields. He went to the cottonwood tree and stood before Martha's grave, hat in hand. "I swore I wouldn't let it go," he said softly. "But I'm tired. I can't make the land live again. Forgive me." The silence of the dry night offered no answer, only the whisper of wind through the brittle branches. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mr. Graham returned, papers ready. Elias stood before the barn, shoulders bent, the sun at his back, and signed his name with a hand that trembled less from age than from the weight of surrender. Graham folded the papers with a smile, pressed a pouch of coins into Elias's palm, and clapped him on the shoulder. "You've done the right thing, Mr. Harper," he said. "No sense dying for dirt." The words stung, but Elias only nodded. He could not speak. When the deal was done, he harnessed his old horse to the wagon and loaded the few belongings he could not bear to leave. Martha's photograph, his father's Bible, a few tools worn smooth from years of use. The house looked smaller than he remembered, the barn more fragile, the land emptier. He lingered a moment, his gaze sweeping over the fields where he had played as a boy, where his children had run laughing, where his wife had hung sheets to dry in the wind. The memories pressed on him so hard he thought they might break him, but he forced himself to climb onto the wagon seat. With a crack of the reins, the horse moved forward, and Elias Harper left his land behind. As he rolled down the road, neighbors watched from their fences and porches. Some shook their heads, others smirked. "About time," one man muttered. Another laughed. Old Harper finally gave up. At the saloon in town later that evening, men raised their glasses and spoke of him with a mix of ridicule and pity. "Sold it for pennies," they said. "Didn't even get enough to buy himself a new pair of boots." The sheriff, overhearing, only sighed and said, "The land broke him. Same as it'll break us all if we stay too long." Elias heard none of it. He rode on, his eyes fixed ahead, the dust rising behind him like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything he once held. The coins in his pocket clinked softly with each jolt of the wagon, but they felt lighter than air, as if they had no weight compared to the burden he carried in his heart. He did not look back again. To look back would be to admit he still belonged there, and that was a truth he could no longer endure. Night fell by the time he reached the edge of the territory, the stars spreading above him in a vast silence. He halted the wagon for a moment, climbed down, and stood alone on the road. In the distance, the horizon stretched wide and dark, a future he could not see, a future he did not trust. He looked once more at Martha's photograph, traced her face with a finger, and whispered, "I tried." Then he climbed back onto the wagon and rode on, the sound of hooves fading into the emptiness. Behind him, on the land he had surrendered, the hole still seeped, dark and glistening in the moonlight. The black substance pooled slowly, patient as time itself, waiting for eyes that could see its worth. But Elias Harper was gone, and with him went the chance to claim a fortune that would one day fuel empires. For now, it was only a stain in the dirt, and the story of the old man who had fought too long and sold too cheap. The road carried Elias Harper away from the land that had shaped him, and with every mile the sound of the horse's hooves seemed to pound the truth deeper into his bones. He no longer owned the fields where he had been born, where he had worked until his hands bled, where he had buried his wife. What remained to him was a pouch of coins that rattled like mockery whenever the wagon jolted, and a few keepsakes wrapped carefully beside him. He rode slowly, not because the horse was weak, but because his heart resisted each step forward. The farm had been more than soil and wood and fences. It had been his very being, and now that it was gone, he felt hollow, like a tree struck by lightning, still standing but burned within. He settled in a small town a few days' journey east, a place that was neither thriving nor empty, caught somewhere between life and abandonment. The streets were dusty, the storefronts weary, and the saloon too full of men with tired eyes. Elias rented a narrow room above a shop, where the window looked down on the main street. The bed sagged, the walls leaned, and the floor groaned beneath his boots, but he told himself he needed no more. He found odd work when he could, fixing fences for ranchers who still had cattle enough to keep, mending wagons, hauling loads for the blacksmith. His back protested, his hands cracked, yet he worked because idleness was worse. Each evening he returned to his room, lit the lamp, and set Martha's photograph on the table, as if her presence could keep him anchored. He would talk to her quietly, telling her how the day had passed, though his words were little more than whispers to the walls. The years crept on, not fast, but steady, each one leaving its mark upon his body. His shoulders stooped, his beard grew more white than gray, and his knees ached when the weather shifted. Townsfolk came to know him as the quiet old man who kept to himself, who did his work without complaint, but never spoke of where he had come from. Some said he had once owned land and lost it to the drought. Others guessed he had squandered it at cards, and a few claimed he had run from debts. Elias did not bother to correct them. To speak of the farm would be to open a wound that had never healed, and he did not care to bleed in public. Then, one evening in the saloon, as he nursed a single glass of whiskey that tasted more of dust than fire, he heard something that made the blood still in his veins. A group of men at the next table were reading aloud from a newspaper freshly arrived on the stagecoach. Their voices carried excitement as they spoke of discoveries in Pennsylvania, of wells that gushed black liquid from the earth, of fortunes made overnight. "Oil," one man said, slapping the page with the back of his hand. "They say it'll be worth more than gold. A man could own nothing but rock and scrub, strike this stuff, and become a king." Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and the talk spilled into speculation about how many wells would be dug, how many fortunes won. Elias sat frozen, his hand tightening around the glass until it trembled. Oil. The word echoed in his mind, heavy and cruel. He saw again the stain that had seeped from his own soil, thick and glistening, the substance that had filled him with disgust and despair. He had thought it a curse, a useless muck that mocked his thirst. He had sold the land for pennies, and now here was the truth, revealed too late. The earth had not mocked him at all. It had given him wealth beyond imagining, and he had thrown it away. The laughter of the men grated against him. He pushed away from the table, leaving the whiskey untouched, and walked out into the night, The air was cool, the stars sharp above, but he felt only heat inside him, the searing burn of irony and loss. He walked the length of the street, boots scuffing the dust, his cane striking in rhythm with his steps. He thought of his grandfather's voice, warning never to surrender the land. He thought of his father's eyes, stern with pride. He thought of Martha, who had trusted him to keep their world alive. And now he knew he had failed them all, not only by letting go, but by letting go of treasure hidden beneath his very feet. Days passed, but the knowledge did not soften. It grew sharper with each repetition of the story, each headline in the paper, each rumor of men striking oil and building empires. Elias heard of fortunes rising overnight, of towns springing up around wells, of railroads built with oil money. And always the image returned, his own fields, the hole he had bored with such desperation, the black liquid seeping up under the sun. He had been the first to touch it in that valley, the first to feel it on his skin, and he had walked away believing it worthless. The irony gnawed at him until sleep fled from him and food lost its taste. One afternoon, he returned to the saloon and heard men discussing land sales in the territory he had left. One of them mentioned the Harper farm by name, saying it had changed hands twice already, and now stood ready for prospectors who believed there was oil beneath it. The name struck Elias like a blow to the chest. His land, no longer his. He left the saloon and walked aimlessly through the town, his cane tapping, his breath short. He could not bear the thought of strangers walking the soil where Martha was buried, strangers striking wealth where he had begged for water. The pain of it threatened to crush him, and he leaned against the wall of a building, eyes closed, whispering to himself, "I was sitting on it, and I let it go." Yet for all the bitterness, Elias did not curse the land. He cursed his ignorance, his blindness, the cruel humor of time that had hidden the truth until it was too late. The land had not betrayed him. He had betrayed himself by not seeing what it offered. He wondered if that was the final test his grandfather had spoken of, the last trial the land demanded of its keepers. If so, he had failed, and the legacy had ended with him. Years settled upon him like dust, and the town moved on without noticing the quiet old man in the room above the shop. He worked less as his body weakened, until at last he no longer worked at all, spending his days sitting by the window, watching wagons pass. Sometimes children shouted in the street below, and their laughter brought a fleeting smile to his lips before fading into silence. He kept the photograph of Martha near, her face the last tether to the life he had lost. At night he dreamed of fields green and full, though when he woke, the smell of oil returned to him, sharp and heavy, as though it had never left his skin. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, Elias rose from his chair and walked slowly down the street. He moved with the dignity of a man whose body was broken, but whose pride still stood. At the edge of town he paused, gazing toward the horizon. He could not see his old farm from there, but in his mind, it stretched before him. The house standing weathered, the barn tilting, the fields scarred by drought. And beneath it all, he knew now, lay the treasure that would one day change the West. He whispered into the cooling air, "The land gave me the answer, and I was too blind to hear it." The stars brightened overhead, one by one, as he turned back toward the dim lamps of the town. His steps were slow, his breath shallow, but in his chest burned a quiet flame of acceptance. He would not be remembered as a rich man, nor as a man who triumphed. He would be remembered, if at all, as the farmer who sat on wealth and sold it for pennies, the stubborn soul who clung to land until it broke him. Yet in that truth, there was still a kind of dignity, for he had never surrendered lightly, The land had tested him, and though he had failed its riddle, he had faced it with all the strength he had to give. When he reached his room, he set Martha's photograph upon the table and sat beside it. His hands folded over the cane, his eyes lingering on her smile, he felt the weight of years settle upon him one last time. Outside, the night hummed with distant voices, the world moving toward a future he would not see, a future fueled by the very substance he had dismissed. He closed his eyes, hearing in memory the sound of the rig groaning, the smell of oil rising from the earth, the laughter of neighbors who had thought him mad. And with a faint smile, half sorrow, half resignation, Elias Harper let the night embrace him, a man who had fought, who had lost, and who had lived long enough to know that sometimes the greatest treasures lie wasted beneath our feet, waiting for another's eyes to see their worth. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.